What if the person making your life a living hell was the one person who should have loved you the most? For 22-year-old Elara Vance, a struggling artist trapped in a waitress uniform. A new customer wasn't just another difficult order. He was a storm, a billionaire named Alistair Sterling, a man whose arrogance was as legendary as his fortune. Every condescending word, every impossible demand felt like a personal attack. But Elara had no idea that the cruelty in his eyes masked a secret that would shatter her world, a secret tied to a silver locket around her neck and a past her mother refused to speak of. This isn't just a story about a waitress and a billionaire. It's about a daughter and a father, separated by lies and brought together by fate in the most unlikely of places. The air in the Gilded Spoon was a familiar symphony of chaos, the clatter of cutlery against porcelain, the hiss of the espresso machine, the low hum of conversations weaving together into a single indecipherable tapestry of sound. For Elara Vance, this symphony was the soundtrack of her life's intermission. By day, she was a waitress, her artist's hands accustomed to the delicate dance of a charcoal pencil, now expertly balancing trays laden with seared scallops and Cabernet Sauvignon. By night, in her tiny, drafty apartment, those same hands would try to sketch a future she so desperately craved, a world of color and canvas, far from the sticky floors and demanding patrons of downtown Boston. She was 22, with eyes the color of a stormy sea, and a resilience forged in the fires of financial hardship. Every dollar she earned was split 3 ways: rent for the apartment she shared with her chronically ill mother Sarah, a growing mountain of medical bills, and the meager remainder which she poured into art supplies that felt more like lifeblood than luxury. On a Tuesday that felt like any other, the storm arrived. He didn't walk in so much as he materialized, parting the restaurant's bustling crowd like a shark cutting through water. He was tall, dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit that probably cost more than her car, and carried an aura of such profound impatience that the air itself seemed to thin around him. His hair was a distinguished silver at the temples, his face etched with the sharp, unforgiving lines of a man who didn't ask for the world, but simply expected it to be handed to him. This was Alistair Sterling, founder and CEO of Sterling Industries, a titan of finance whose face was a regular feature on the covers of Forbes and the Wall Street Journal. He was seated in Elara's section. Of course he was. "I need a table, by the window. Now," he said to the hostess, not as a request, but as a statement of fact. "Sir, there's a 20-minute wait for window seating, but I can—" "No." He cut her off, his voice a low, dismissive rumble. "You don't understand. I am sitting there." He pointed to a two-top that was still being cleared. The hostess, a flustered teenager named Maya, looked to Elara with panicked eyes. Elara pasted on her professional smile, a fragile armor she wore every shift. "Right this way, sir. We're just resetting it for you." As he sat, he didn't thank her. He didn't even look at her. He pulled out his phone, his thumb swiping across the screen with predatory speed. Elara placed the menu on the table. He ignored it. "I'll have a black coffee. Espresso. Lavazza, if you have it. If not, don't bother. And it needs to be 190 degrees Fahrenheit. Not 189, not 191. Use a thermometer. I'll also have the steak tartare. Tell the chef no capers. I despise them. And the egg yolk had better be perfectly centered and unbroken." Elara's pen hovered over her notepad. "Of course, sir. And for your main course." He finally looked up, and his eyes, a cold, piercing blue, made her feel like a specimen under a microscope. Do I look like a man with time for a main course? This is it. Be quick about it. He waved his hand, a gesture of dismissal, and his attention was once again consumed by his phone. Elara retreated to the kitchen, her composure fraying. "You've got to be kidding me," she muttered to Chloe, another waitress. "Table 7, Alistair Sterling. He wants his coffee temperature checked and his egg yolk geometrically perfect." Chloe whistled. "Good luck. I heard he once tried to sue a valet for leaving a fingerprint on his steering wheel. He's a nightmare." Elara delivered the coffee, having personally stood over the barista, with the kitchen's meat thermometer feeling utterly ridiculous. He took a sip without looking up. "Passable," he grunted. It was the highest compliment she would receive from him that day. The tartare was a masterpiece of culinary anxiety. The chef, a burly man named Gus, who normally feared no one, had replated it 3 times to ensure the yolk was perfectly centered. Elara carried it to the table as if it were a bomb. Sterling stared at it for a long, agonizing moment. He poked at the meat with his fork, then at the yolk, which thankfully held its shape. He took a bite. Elara held her breath. "The toast points are uneven," he said flatly, gesturing to the 4 triangular pieces of bread. "One is clearly thicker than the others. Is this the level of mediocrity the Gilded Spoon strives for?" Elara's training screamed at her to apologize, to offer to fix it, to grovel. But something else, a deeper, more weary part of her took over. "I can assure you, sir, their flavor is uniformly excellent." The corner of his mouth twitched an almost imperceptible flicker of surprise. He held her gaze for a second longer than was comfortable, a flicker of something unreadable in his cold eyes. Then he broke the stare and finished his meal in a tense, methodical silence. When he was done, he pushed the plate away, the thicker toast point left untouched in silent protest. Elara brought the bill. He placed a black credit card on the tray, the name A. Sterling embossed in silver. She ran the card and returned with the slip for him to sign. He scribbled a signature and stood up, adjusting his suit jacket. "The service was adequate." He said the word adequate, sounding like a grave insult from his lips. He strode out of the restaurant, leaving the same chill in the air as when he arrived. Elara walked over to the table to clear it, steeling herself for what she might find on the tip line. On a bill of $58, he had left exactly 0. But that wasn't the worst part. Scrawled at the bottom of the receipt in sharp, angry letters were 2 words: "Try harder." Elara stared at the note, a hot flush of anger and humiliation creeping up her neck. It wasn't just rude, it was personal. It was a dismissal of her effort, of her existence. She crumpled the receipt in her hand, the sharp corners digging into her palm. She didn't know it then, but this was not an ending. It was a declaration of war. And Alistair Sterling, for reasons he didn't even understand himself, was about to become a regular. The following Tuesday, at precisely 12:30 p.m., he returned. Elara's stomach twisted into a knot the moment she saw him walk through the door. He scanned the room, his eyes landing on her section, and then with an unnerving sense of purpose, he walked directly to the same two-top by the window. He didn't wait for the hostess. He simply sat as if the table were his private property. "You again," he said, as Elara approached her notepad, a flimsy shield against his presence. "Let's hope for an improvement." "Welcome back to the Gilded Spoon, Mr. Sterling," she replied, her voice professionally level, betraying none of the dread churning within her. His orders became a ritual of torment. He would ask for obscure wines and then send them back, claiming they were corked, when Elara knew they weren't. He would complain that his soup was tepid one week and scalding the next. He quizzed her on the origin of the sea bass, the marbling of the ribeye, the specific type of basil used in the pesto, all with the condescending air of a professor trying to expose a failing student. Each visit was a masterclass in psychological warfare. He never raised his voice. His cruelty was quiet, precise, and soul-crushingly effective. He seemed to have an almost supernatural ability to find her insecurities and press down hard. One afternoon, he noticed a faint smudge of charcoal on her wrist, a remnant from her late-night sketching session. An artist, he'd sneered softly, a cruel smile playing on his lips. Let me guess, you're following your passion, a noble excuse for mediocrity in the real world. Passion doesn't pay the bills, results do. His words hit her like a physical blow, striking at the very core of her identity. How could a stranger know the exact nature of her deepest anxieties? The fear that she was just a cliché, a deluded dreamer, destined to serve tables for the rest of her life. She would go home after his visits drained and raw, the echo of his condescension ringing in her ears. She'd vent to her mother, Sarah, whose frail health confined her mostly to their small apartment. He sounds like a monster, honey. Sarah would say, her voice thin but full of warmth as she sipped her herbal tea. Don't let him get to you. People like that are just black holes of misery. But Elara couldn't shake it. There was something about him that was different from other rude customers. It felt targeted. One rainy Tuesday, about a month into his weekly campaign of torment, he ordered something that wasn't on the menu. I want the fennel and orange salad with toasted pine nuts, he stated, not looking up from a stack of documents he'd spread across the table. Elara paused. I'm sorry, sir, that isn't one of our current offerings. He finally looked at her. His blue eyes narrowed. It used to be. Years ago. This restaurant was once called La Petite Lune. They made it here. Tell your chef to make it. Sir, our kitchen is stocked for our current menu. I highly doubt we have the specific ingredients. Then find them, he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous command. Consider it a test of your resourcefulness. I expect results, not excuses. Defeated Elara went to the kitchen. Gus, you're not going to believe this, she began. Gus the chef threw his hands up. Let me guess. Sterling wants us to source unicorn tears for his water. Close. He wants a fennel and orange salad that was on the menu of a restaurant that existed here 10 years ago. Gus swore under his breath, but then he paused, a look of recognition on his face. La Petite Lune. I remember that place. My first sous chef job. We did make a killer fennel salad. He thought for a moment. You know what, I think I have a fennel bulb in the back I was saving for a special. And there are oranges. Go tell the monster he's in luck. When Elara placed the salad in front of Alistair Sterling, his reaction was not what she expected. He didn't critique it. He didn't complain. He simply stared at it for a full minute, his power broker facade dissolving into something else. Something distant. Lost. He picked up his fork and took a bite. As he chewed, his eyes glazed over as if he were tasting a memory. He was silent for the rest of the meal. When he left, he still didn't leave a tip, but the usual insulting note was absent. For Elara, the silence was more unnerving than the criticism. That night, she described the strange encounter to her mother. He knew the restaurant used to be called La Petite Lune, Elara said, flopping onto the worn armchair. and he ordered this weirdly specific salad, fennel and orange. The teacup in Sarah's hand trembled, rattling against the saucer. The color drained from her already pale face. "Mum, are you okay?" Elara asked, sitting up straight. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Sarah forced a weak smile, but her eyes were wide with a fear Elara had never seen before. No, I'm fine, dear. Just a little dizzy." She clutched the shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Fennel and orange, that was my favorite. Your father, he used to take me there. To La Petite Lune. It was our special place." Elara froze. Her father was a forbidden topic, a ghost who haunted the edges of their lives. All her mother would ever say was that he was a passionate, ambitious boy who wasn't ready for a family. She had no name, no face, nothing but a vague, romanticized tragedy. What did he look like, Mum?" Elara asked, her voice barely a whisper. Sarah's eyes darted away, refusing to meet her daughter's gaze. "It was a long time ago, Elara. It doesn't matter now." She stood up, her movements unsteady. "I need to rest." As her mother shuffled off to her bedroom, Elara stood motionless in the middle of the living room, a cold, terrifying thought beginning to form in her mind. It was impossible, a coincidence. It had to be. But for the first time, she felt that the cruelty of Alistair Sterling wasn't random at all. It was a thread pulling at a tapestry of secrets she never knew existed. And she was standing right at the center of it. The seed of suspicion, once planted, began to sprout, twisting its roots around Elara's thoughts. Every interaction with Alistair Sterling was now filtered through this new, terrifying lens. She started noticing things she'd previously dismissed. The way he held his fork with his index finger extended along the top, a peculiar habit her mother had once idly mentioned, was a quirk of her long-lost love. The way his eyes in rare, unguarded moments held a profound, almost bottomless loneliness that felt strangely familiar. She started wearing the locket. It was her most prized possession, a small silver oval tarnished with age. The front was etched with a delicate pattern of intertwined vines. Inside one side was meant for a photo, a space that had remained hauntingly empty her entire life. Her mother had given it to her on her 16th birthday, her hands trembling as she fastened the delicate chain around Elara's neck. "This was from him," Sarah had whispered, her eyes misty. "It's all I have left of him." Elara wore it now as a test, a silent question aimed at the man who tormented her. She tucked it under her uniform, but made sure the chain was visible. She wanted to see if he would notice, if he would react. For 2 weeks, nothing. He continued his ritual of quiet cruelty, his eyes never straying to her collarbone. Elara began to feel foolish, her theory collapsing under the weight of his indifference. It was just a coincidence. Her mind was playing tricks on her, trying to weave a grand drama out of the mundane misery of her job. Then came the day of the storm, a real one this time. Rain lashed against the large windows of the Gilded Spoon, the skier bruised purple. The restaurant was less crowded, the atmosphere more intimate and subdued. Alistair Sterling sat at his usual table, staring out at the downpour, a glass of untouched whiskey beside him. He seemed different today, his usual sharp edges softened by a contemplative gloom. Elara was refilling his water when she leaned over slightly. The locket, no longer tucked away, swung free from the collar of her uniform, catching the dim light of the overhead lamp. It dangled in the space between them for a mere second. Sterling's hand, which was reaching for his glass, froze mid-air. His gaze dropped from her face to the small silver oval. Every ounce of color drained from his face, replaced by a ghastly ashen pallor. The arrogant billionaire vanished, replaced by a man seeing a ghost. His breath hitched a small, strangled sound in the quiet restaurant. "Where?" he began, his voice a raw, cracked whisper she could barely hear over the rain. "Where did you get that?" Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. The reaction. It was real. "It was a gift," she said, her own voice unsteady. "From my mother." His eyes, wide and disbelieving, shot up to meet hers. They weren't cold and piercing anymore. They were filled with a chaotic storm of emotions she couldn't decipher. Shock, pain, confusion, and something that looked terrifyingly like recognition. He looked at her face, truly looked at her as if for the first time. He scanned her features, the shape of her eyes, the curve of her jaw, the stubborn set of her mouth. It was as if he was searching for something, a ghost in her living face. He abruptly pushed his chair back, the legs scraping violently against the hardwood floor. The sound was so jarring it turned heads at nearby tables. He threw a $100 bill onto the table, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. "I have to go," he muttered, not to her, but to the air itself. He practically fled from the restaurant without his coat out into the driving rain. Ilara stood frozen, her hand instinctively clutching the now warm locket against her chest. Her breath came in ragged gasps. The $100 bill on the table was more than a tip. It was a surrender, a white flag from a man in full retreat. She finished her shift in a daze, her mind replaying that moment of raw, unmasked shock on his face over and over. The certainty was no longer a suspicion. It was a concrete weight in the pit of her stomach. That night, she didn't just ask her mother. She demanded. She found Sarah in the living room, reading by the dim light of a floor lamp. Ilara walked over and stood in front of her, blocking the light. She held the locket out in her palm. "His name is Alistair Sterling," Ilara said, her voice shaking with a mixture of anger and grief. "Isn't it?" Sarah looked at the locket, then up at her daughter's face, her expression crumbling. The years of carefully constructed denial, of evasions and half-truths fell away, leaving only a raw, heart-breaking vulnerability. Tears welled in her eyes, silent and immediate. How did you? He's been coming into the restaurant, Mum. For weeks. He's been awful, cruel. And today he saw this." Ilara's voice broke. "He saw this locket, and he looked at me. He looked at me, and he knew." Sarah began to sob, deep, wrenching sobs that shook her entire body. It was the sound of a dam breaking, of 2 decades of secrets and sorrow flooding into the open. "I'm so sorry, Ilara," she cried, reaching for her daughter's hand. "I never wanted you to meet him like this. I never wanted you to meet him at all." Ilara sank to her knees in front of her mother's chair, the hard truth washing over her in a sickening wave. The monster from the restaurant, the cruel, condescending billionaire who made her feel worthless, the man who left insulting notes instead of tips. That man was her father. The small, cozy living room, usually a sanctuary of warmth and comfort, for Ilara suddenly felt like a clutch. The air was thick with unspoken words, with 22 years of a single, monumental lie. Sarah's sobs subsided into ragged, weary breaths. She wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her cardigan, her gaze fixed on a point in the middle distance, as if watching a film of her own past. "Tell me everything," Ilara said, her voice quiet but firm. "No more secrets, Mom. I deserve to know." Sarah nodded slowly, her gaze finally meeting Elara's. It was the look of a woman who had carried a heavy burden for too long and was finally ready to set it down. His name was Ali, then? She began, her voice soft and distant. Just Ali. He wasn't Alistair Sterling, the titan of industry. He was a boy from the wrong side of the tracks with a fire in his eyes that could either light up the world or burn it all down. He was studying economics on a scholarship, working 3 jobs, and he had this ferocious ambition. He was going to conquer the world, and I was foolish enough to believe I could conquer it with him. She spoke of their meeting at a college library, of late-night talks fueled by cheap coffee and big dreams. He wasn't cruel then. He was intense, passionate, and fiercely intelligent. He'd wooed her with poetry and promises of a future filled with art and adventure. He was the one who bought her the silver locket from a small antique shop, telling her it would hold their story. La Petite Lune was our place, Sarah continued, a faint, sad smile touching her lips. We'd save up for weeks to afford 1 meal there. He always made me order the fennel and orange salad. He said it was as bright and surprising as I was. Elara's heart ached. The image of the young, ambitious boy was so violently at odds with the cold, arrogant man she knew. What happened? Elara prompted gently. Sarah's smile faded. He started getting noticed. An internship at a big firm, a mentor who saw his ruthless potential. The world he wanted to conquer started opening its doors to him, and he ran through them without looking back. He became different, more focused, colder. Our late-night talks turned into him working on stock portfolios, while I sat in silence. I felt myself becoming a footnote in his grand story. Then came the inevitable. Sarah discovered she was pregnant. I was terrified, but I was also so happy. She whispered her hand, instinctively going to her stomach, as if the memory still lived there. I thought a baby would bring him back to me. To us. I told him in our favorite spot, a bench overlooking the Charles River. I imagined he'd be thrilled. She paused, taking a shaky breath. He went completely still. I'll never forget the look on his face. It wasn't joy. It wasn't even anger. It was calculation. Like I was a variable in an equation he was trying to solve. He told me a baby wasn't part of his 5-year plan. He said it would be an anchor, tying him down when he was about to set sail. The words even recounted 2 decades later were brutal. Elara felt a fresh wave of anger on her mother's behalf. He disappeared for a week, Sarah said, her voice flat. No calls, nothing. I was a wreck. Then one day a man in a suit I'd never seen before showed up at my door. A lawyer. His name was Marcus Thorne. He handed me a cashier's check for $50,000. $50,000, Elara gasped. It was an enormous sum back then. And a contract, Sarah added, her eyes glistening with fresh tears. The money was contingent on me signing a non-disclosure agreement. I was to disappear from Alistair's life, never contact him again, and never reveal the identity of my child's father. The contract stated that this was a clean break to allow him to pursue his unfettered professional ascent. The corporate sterile language was so quintessentially Alistair Sterling that it made Elara sick to her stomach. What did you do? I tore up the contract in the lawyer's face, Sarah said, a flicker of the old fire returning to her eyes. But I kept the check, not for me. For you. I put it in a trust fund that I never touched. I was so proud, so determined to prove that I didn't need his blood money. I wanted to raise you on my own terms. That money is what paid for your first year of art school, Elara, It's the only thing he ever gave you." She finally broke down again, the shame and pain of the memory overwhelming her. "I should have told you. I was just so ashamed, and I wanted to protect you. I didn't want you to know that your father was a man who tried to buy your absence." Elara wrapped her arms around her mother, holding her tight as she cried. All the anger Elara felt towards her mother for keeping the secret dissolved, replaced by a profound understanding of her sacrifice. Her mother had shielded her, not just from a name, but from a devastating truth that she was the daughter of a man who saw her as a liability on a balance sheet. As she held her mother, Elara's sorrow began to crystallize into something harder, something clearer. Resolve. She now understood the cruelty in his eyes at the restaurant. It wasn't just a billionaire's arrogance. It was the deep, unsettling discomfort of a man being confronted by a past he had paid to bury. She wasn't just a waitress to him. She was a ghost, a walking, talking reminder of a choice he had made, of a life he had discarded. His torment of her was a desperate, pathetic attempt to maintain control, to diminish the woman who was living proof of his own heartlessness. The fight was no longer about bad tips and insulting notes. It was about her mother's honor. It was about her own identity. Alistair Sterling wanted a clean break. He wasn't going to get one. He had started this war at her table, but she was going to end it in his world. The next morning, Elara woke with a purpose that felt like ice in her veins. She was no longer just a waitress or a struggling artist. She was Sarah Vance's daughter, and she was going to confront the man who had tried to erase them. She called the restaurant and quit. The manager, Mr. Henderson, was shocked, but Elara's voice left no room for argument. The Gilded Spoon was a chapter of her life that was now closed. Her target was Sterling Tower, a monument of glass and steel that clawed at the Boston skyline, a physical manifestation of Alistair's ambition. Dressed not in her waitress uniform, but in her best black blouse and slacks, her gallery-opening outfit, she felt like a soldier heading into battle. The lobby was an expanse of marble and hushed importance. A severe-looking receptionist sat behind a desk the size of a small car. "I'm here to see Alistair Sterling," Elara said, her voice far steadier than her hammering heart. The receptionist didn't even look up from her computer. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but if you tell him it's about La Petite Lune, he'll see me." Elara was banking on the name being a grenade powerful enough to blow past the corporate defenses. The woman's perfectly manicured fingers paused on her keyboard. She gave Elara a dismissive once-over, then sighed and picked up her phone, murmuring into the receiver. A moment later, she looked up, a flicker of surprise in her eyes. "He's not available. Mr. Thorne from the legal department will see you." "No," Elara said firmly. "I'm not here to see his lawyer. I'm here to see him." But it was too late. A tall, impeccably dressed man with graying hair and a weary expression was already striding towards her. He was older now, but Elara recognized the name instantly from her mother's story. Marcus Thorne, the man who had delivered the check. "Miss," he said, his voice smooth and practiced. "I'm Marcus Thorne, Mr. Sterling's general counsel. Perhaps I can assist you." "You can assist me by getting out of my way," Elara replied. Her eyes locked on the elevator bank behind him. "I'm afraid I can't do that," Thorne said, his expression hardening slightly. "Whatever your business is with Mr. Sterling, it can be addressed through the proper channels." Elara knew she had one shot. She wasn't going to get past this man with polite requests. So she did the one thing they wouldn't expect. She raised her voice. "Alistair!" she shouted, her voice ringing through the cathedral-like silence of the lobby. Heads turned. The receptionist gasped. "Alistair Sterling, you can send your lawyer, you can hide on the 50th floor, but I know who you are. Sarah Vance sent me." Security guards started moving towards her. Thorne's face was a mask of controlled panic. "Miss, you need to lower your voice. You're creating a disturbance." "Good," she yelled, her voice trembling but resolute. "He disturbed our lives. It's time I disturbed his." Just as a security guard reached for her arm, a disembodied voice crackled from Thorne's earpiece. He listened, his eyes widening slightly. He held up a hand to the guards, stopping them in their tracks. He looked at Alara, a new grudging respect in his eyes. "Fine," he sighed, gesturing towards the private elevator. "He'll see you, against my very strong advice." The elevator ride to the penthouse floor was a silent, tension-filled ascent. The doors opened directly into a vast, minimalist office that felt more like an art gallery than a workspace. 3 of the walls were floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a godlike view of the city below. The 4th was dominated by a single, massive abstract painting in shades of black and grey. And behind a sprawling black desk sat Alistair Sterling. He looked haggard. The arrogant mask was gone, replaced by a deep, troubled exhaustion. He hadn't slept. "Leave us, Marcus," he commanded, his voice hoarse. Thorne gave Alara one last warning look before retreating, the elevator doors closing with a soft hiss, sealing them in. "What do you want?" Alistair asked, his hands steepled in front of him on the desk. "Money, is that it? After all these years, you've come for more money." The accusation was so predictable, so insulting that Alara's fear evaporated, replaced by a cold, righteous anger. "Money," she laughed, a bitter, sharp sound. "You think this is about money? You send your lackey to offer my mother a check to disappear. You spend a month tormenting me at my job, and you think I came here for a handout." She walked closer, her footsteps echoing on the polished concrete floor. She reached into her purse and pulled out an old, faded photograph, slapping it down on his pristine desk. It was a picture of a young Sarah and an even younger Alistair laughing on a park bench, the Boston skyline behind them. He looked happy, carefree, a version of himself he had probably murdered long ago. "This is what I want," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "I want you to look at her face and tell me how much she was worth." 50,000. 100. What's the going rate for abandoning your child? Mr. Sterling. He flinched as if she'd struck him, his eyes fixed on the photograph. He seemed to shrink in his expensive chair. "She told me you tore up the contract," he murmured almost to himself. "She did," Alara shot back. "But you didn't know that, did you? You just assumed she took the money and ran. It was easier that way. No guilt, no consequences. Just a clean transaction." She leaned forward, placing her palms flat on his desk. "Well, the transaction isn't clean anymore. I am the consequence. And my mother is sick, Alistair. She has a heart condition, and the stress of all this isn't helping. For 22 years, she protected me from you, from this truth. She worked her fingers to the bone so she wouldn't have to touch your blood money. She is 10 times the person you will ever be." Alistair finally looked up from the photo, his eyes swimming with a turmoil she had never seen before. The cold arrogance was completely gone, replaced by a raw, naked pain. I didn't know," he stammered. "Sick, I never—" "Of course you didn't know." Alara's voice rose. "You didn't know because you didn't want to know. You built this glass tower as a monument to yourself, and you locked the door on anything that didn't fit into your perfect calculated life. Well, I'm here to break the glass." He stood up, looking utterly lost in the cavernous office. He walked to the window, his back to her, staring down at the city he had conquered. "What do you want from me?" he asked again. But this time the question was different. It wasn't an accusation. It was a plea. "I want you to know that you didn't just walk away from a problem," Elara said, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "You walked away from a daughter, and she's standing right behind you." He didn't turn around. He just stood there, his shoulders slumped. A silhouette of power against a backdrop of his own creation. Utterly and completely defeated. Elara had breached the fortress, but what lay inside was not a monster, but the ruins of a man. Alistair remained at the window for a long time, the silence in the office stretching thin and taut. The sounds of the city below, distant sirens, the hum of traffic were a faint reminder of the world he usually commanded, but now seemed completely detached from. Elara stood her ground, her anger beginning to cool into a heavy, watchful stillness. Finally, he turned. The fight was gone from his eyes, replaced by a hollowed-out confusion. "You have her eyes," he said, his voice raspy. "I should have seen it. I think some part of me did. That's why I kept coming back. I couldn't understand why a stranger, a waitress, could get under my skin. It's easy to get under your skin when they're your own flesh and blood," Elara retorted, though the fire in her words was banking. He sank back into his chair, looking decades older than he had an hour ago. He pressed a button on his intercom. "Marcus, in my office, now." Marcus Thorne entered the room with the cautious tread of a man walking into a minefield. He glanced from Alistair's shattered expression to Elara's defiant one. "Marcus?" Alistair began, his voice flat and devoid of its usual authority. "Tell me again. The Sarah Vance file. Exactly what happened?" Thorne stiffened. "Sir, with all due respect, perhaps this isn't the appropriate—" "Now, Marcus," Alistair commanded, a flicker of his old power returning. 22 years ago. Tell me." The lawyer sighed, a deep, weary sound that seemed to carry the weight of years. He looked at Elara, then at his boss. "The plan was as you instructed. I was to present Miss Vance with the settlement and the non-disclosure agreement. A clean break." "And she accepted," Alistair stated, though it now sounded like a question. Thorne hesitated. His eyes darted between them. He seemed to be having a war with his own conscience. "This is a matter of attorney-client privilege, Alistair." "To hell with privilege!" Alistair slammed his fist on the desk, the sound echoing in the stark room. "This is my daughter." The words spoken aloud for the first time seemed to hang in the air, electric and fragile. Thorne took a deep breath, his professional mask crumbling. "She didn't accept, not at first. As your daughter said, she tore up the agreement. She was furious, proud. She said you couldn't buy her dignity." Elara watched the lawyer, a new, unexpected twist tightening in her gut. "But the check was cashed," Alistair insisted, his brow furrowed in confusion. "The bank records confirmed it." "Yes," Thorne said quietly. "It was, about a week later." He paused, steeling himself. "But there's something you don't know. Something your father made me swear never to tell you." Alistair went rigid. "My father, he was your primary mentor back then." Thorne explained, his voice low. "He was grooming you, pushing you. He saw Sarah and the baby as a threat to the empire he wanted you to build. When I reported back that she had refused the offer, he intervened. The story that unfolded was a second, deeper layer of betrayal. Alistair's father, a man as ruthless as his son would become, had visited Sarah personally. He hadn't used threats, but a far more insidious weapon, emotional manipulation. He'd told her that if she truly loved Alistair, she would let him go. He painted a picture of a brilliant future she would destroy, of a man she would forever resent her for holding back. He convinced her that cashing the check and disappearing was the most selfless act of love she could perform. And then he took it a step further. Thorne continued, his gaze fixed on the floor. Sarah did more than just cash the check. A month after that, she came to my office. She had a letter for you, Alistair, and she tried to give the money back. Alistair looked as if he'd been punched in the gut. What? She'd had time to think. She said she couldn't live with herself taking the money, that it felt dirty. She had secured a small apartment and a job. The letter, I read it. She wrote that she didn't want anything from you, but she thought you had a right to know that you had a beautiful, healthy daughter. She even enclosed a photograph of the baby. Elara felt the air leave her lungs. Her mother had tried to reach him. She had tried to give him a chance. "Where is it?" Alistair whispered, his voice cracking. "The letter. The photograph. Your father intercepted it." Thorne confessed the words rushing out now. He was furious. He said you couldn't afford the distraction. He burned the letter and the photo in front of me. He told me to transfer the money from your account to close the loop. And he ordered me to tell you that Sarah had simply taken the money and vanished without a word. He said it would be better for you to think she was greedy than for you to be haunted by a child you couldn't have. He thought he was protecting your ambition, protecting his investment. The truth landed in the room with the force of a physical impact. Alistair Sterling, the master of his own universe, the man who believed he had made a hard but necessary choice, was a pawn in his own father's game. He hadn't just been cruel, he had been deceived. The narrative that had shaped him for 2 decades, that the love of his life had sold their story for $50,000, was a lie. He had spent his life hardening his heart against a woman who had in fact tried to reach him, tried to give him an opening. He staggered back, gripping the edge of his desk for support. The foundation of his entire adult life. The justification for his coldness, his isolation, his relentless pursuit of success above all else had just been demolished. He looked at Elara, and for the first time she saw not a tyrant or a father, but a man drowning in a sea of regret. He had been a villain in her story, but he was also a victim in his own. All this time, Alistair breathed the words catching in his throat. All this time, I thought. He couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The anger in Elara's heart, the righteous fury that had carried her to this office, finally completely dissolved. It was replaced by a profound and aching sadness for the 3 lives that had been broken by pride, ambition, and a devastating decades-old lie. The revelation hung in the sterile air of the office, changing everything. Alistair was no longer a simple villain, but a tragic figure trapped in a cage built by his father's ambition and his own. He seemed to crumble before Elara's eyes, the weight of 22 lost years crashing down on him at once. He fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking so badly he could barely unlock it. "Cancel my meetings," he barked at his assistant through the speaker. "All of them, for the rest of the week." He looked at Elara, his expression stripped bare of all artifice. It was a look of pure, unadulterated desperation. "The hospital," he said, his voice ragged. "Where is she? Take me to her." Elara hesitated for a fraction of a second. A part of her, the wounded part that had been tormented for weeks, wanted to refuse to make him suffer a little longer. But looking at the broken man before her, she knew that revenge was a hollow victory. This was about more than just settling a score. She nodded. Boston General, Cardiac Care Unit. The ride down in the elevator was silent. The ride in his chauffeured Maybach was even quieter. Alistair stared out the window, but he wasn't seeing the city. He was seeing ghosts. Elara watched him, a complex storm of emotions churning inside her. She felt pity, anger, confusion, and a strange, unwelcome flicker of empathy. They walked into the hospital, the smell of antiseptic and illness, a stark contrast to the leather and polish of his car. Alistair, in his perfect suit, looked profoundly out of place, a king in a land of the sick and suffering. When they reached the door to Sarah's room, he stopped, his hand hovering over the handle, his nerve failing him. "I can't," he whispered, his voice thick with fear. "What can I possibly say to her?" "Maybe you could start with hello," Elara said softly, pushing the door open. Sarah was sitting up in bed, propped against a stack of pillows, a book lying open in her lap. She was paler and more frail under the harsh fluorescent lights. She looked up as they entered her eyes, first finding Elara, then sliding to the man standing behind her. Her breath caught in her throat. The book slipped from her fingers, falling silently to the blanket. "Ali," she whispered the name, a ghost on her lips. Alistair took a hesitant step into the room. He looked at the woman in the hospital bed, the vibrant girl from his memories, now faded and worn by time and illness. He saw the IV drip in her arm, the heart monitor beeping a steady, fragile rhythm beside her bed. This was the reality of his clean break. Tears streamed down his face, silent and unchecked. He made a choked sound, a sob of pure, undiluted regret. "Sarah," he breathed, "I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I swear to God I didn't know." He stumbled forward and collapsed into the visitor's chair by her bed, his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking with the force of his sobs. All the power, all the arrogance, all the billions of dollars were meaningless. He was just a man, weeping for a past he could never get back. Sarah watched him, her own eyes filling with tears. She reached out a trembling hand and placed it on his arm. "I know, Ali," she said softly. "I know." Elara stood in the doorway, a silent witness to the reunion of two people whose lives had diverged so tragically. It was messy and painful, and decades too late. But it was real. In the days that followed, Alistair Sterling mobilized his empire for a singular purpose. He had Sarah transferred to a private suite. He flew in the best cardiac specialists from around the world. He paid for everything, brushing aside any talk of cost. But it wasn't just about money anymore. He showed up, every single day. He sat by Sarah's bed, sometimes talking for hours, filling in the silent decades, confessing his regrets, listening to her stories about raising Elara. Other times they would just sit in a comfortable silence, two people rediscovering a language they had long forgotten. His interactions with Elara were awkward and tentative. He didn't know how to be a father. He offered her things: a new apartment, a car, tuition to any art school in the world. Elara politely refused them all. "I don't want your money, Alistair," she told him one afternoon in the hospital cafeteria. "I never did." "Then what do you want?" he asked, his frustration and helplessness evident. "I want my mother to get better," she said, "and after that, I don't know." Maybe I just want a father who asks about my art. The next day, he came to the hospital not with a specialist, but with a large flat portfolio. He handed it to her. Inside were the finest German-made charcoals, Japanese sketchbooks, and a set of professional-grade pastels. "Tell me about your art," he said, his voice quiet, hopeful. It was a start, a small, fragile first step on a long, uncertain road. There were no magic wands, no instant happy family. There was a mountain of pain and 22 years of absence that could never be fully erased. Sarah's prognosis was improving, but the future was still uncertain. Elara knew she might never fully forgive him. Forgiveness wasn't a single event, but a process, and theirs was just beginning. But as she sat there in the sterile hospital cafeteria, showing her father her sketches for the first time, she felt a glimmer of something she hadn't felt before. It wasn't happiness, not yet. It was hope. The hope that what was broken could with time and effort be mended, and that even the most damaged roots could find a way to grow again. And so the story of Elara Vance and Alistair Sterling doesn't end with a perfect storybook reunion. It ends with a beginning, a difficult, complicated, and painfully real beginning. It's a powerful reminder that our lives are shaped not just by the choices we make, but by the truths we're told and the secrets that are kept from us. Alistair's wealth couldn't buy back a single lost moment, but his humility, born from devastating truth, opened the door for a second chance. It's a story about how the deepest wounds can sometimes come from family, but also how family can sometimes be the only place to find true healing. What do you think? Can 2 decades of pain and lies ever be truly overcome? Is forgiveness possible, or are some wounds just too deep? We'd love to read your thoughts on this incredible story in the comments below. If this story moved you, please hit that like button to let us know. Share it with someone who appreciates a story about the complexities of life and family. And most importantly, if you want more true-life dramas and compelling narratives like this one, make sure you subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell. You won't want to miss what we have coming next. Thank you for listening.